Okay, let's talk today about security in Niagara, and particularly as it relates to stations and how best to secure your station so only the people that you want to have access can have the access they need. We do this in Niagara by creating objects, you're familiar with that, like HVAC and lighting, and then we create categories in our category service and assign those objects to those categories. And then we create users and give the users access to the categories, thus giving them access to the objects that are in the categories. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do. Let me start you out by telling you on this station, I've created a brand new blank station, although to speed things up on the video, I already created an HVAC folder with a few objects in it that might represent the kinds of objects you'll see, and lighting folder the same kind of way. Other than that, I've created a couple of categories that I'll show you those here shortly. And then relevant to this discussion is I've created a PX graphics page, very simple PX graphic that kind of represents HVAC things that people might want to be able to see and get into. So to start with, let's talk about categories. The category service, as you may have seen before, when you first open it up on a brand new blank station, it has category 1, 2, 3, all the way up through category 8 by default. And you can use those categories if you like. There is a functionality though where you can go in and change the name of the category. Still works the same way, it's just got a different name. Helps you, organize things a little bit better. And the way you do that is to go into your category manager. And you can see that I've got those 6 categories that I've created. General and HVAC lighting, user service, alarm service, and history service. And I'll show you where those come into play in just my example here. And when you look at the category service, you can see that it's got those categories listed across, and then if you didn't make any more than that, it just defaults back to category 7 and 8. And you can create more if you like, if you have a need for it. So we start by thinking, what kinds of users might have access to our system? And here's a point where I think it's very wise for you to create some kind of a map. I mean, on paper, draw it out to give yourself a little bit of a kind of a visual reference of what different types of users you might have. Not the users specifically individual people, but in our case, we're going to have a user who has basic access to the system. They can only see certain things. They cannot see other things. We have a commissioner who can see more and more things and actually change things that a user can't see. And of course we have our administrator, which is what I'm logged in on right now. So I have access to everything, and that's by default. So we've got our categories, and again we're in the category service, and what I'll do is we're going to go and put these objects into the categories. So I'll open up my config folder here, and notice that everything right now, when you first create one, defaults to just inheriting their permissions, or their category that is, from the parent. And since the config is the top level here, then everything below it just inherits its same excuse me, everything else above it just inherits its same category. We said that we have an HVAC category that we're going to put the HVAC lighting in, or HVAC in, sorry. So the way you do that is pretty straightforward. Just open it up and then go in and click on the HVAC category on the HVAC row. Worth noting is that if I open it up, all of its things are now inheriting their category from their parent. If for some reason I wanted to put one of these in the lighting category, say, I could do that, or another category. Each item on this list down the left hand side here has to be in one category or another. It cannot be in none. But you can put them in more than one. So for example, if I wanted to add the warehouse space temp to a bunch of different categories, we're all set. I can turn them off, but I can't turn off the last one. They have to be involved in at least one. I don't really want the warehouse space temp in this case to be separate, so I'll just make it default. So what we've said is that HVAC, the folder, belongs in the HVAC category. And then we'll do the same thing with lighting, although we'll put it in the lighting category. And so with its children. Okay, you can imagine that a user, you might give access to the HVAC category, but not to the lighting category, so the user would then have access to these things, but not to these things because they're not part of their I'm sorry, not to these things because they're not part of the HVAC category. Okay, I'll show you how all that works here shortly. Often it's a good idea to go into your services and create a separate category for some of the more common types of services. For example, user service. A user might want to have access to be able to change their password. You don't want to give necessarily everybody in the HVAC category access to change a password, and you might want to give different permissions to this column than you do to this column. Well, that'll make more sense here in just a second. So we just made a separate category called user service category for the user service. The alarm service category will put in its own, the alarm service will put in its own category, and the history service will put in its own category. So pretty straightforward there. Everything else is in the general category. One other thing here, you remember my PX page that I created? Well, we want people to have access to that too. So we're going to put, remember it was a graphic that had to do with HVAC, so we're going to put it in the HVAC category too. It's something notable to remember. I could give a user access to all these points, but if I don't give them access to the graphics page, they can't see them anyway. Okay. All right, so really you just go through and categorize everything in your station so that you can assign different permissions to each one, and then we'll create users. Here I'm going to go into the user service. I better save that before I go. And we'll create the users who have access to those categories. Pretty easy. All right, these are the default users, admin and guest. Let's create some new users here. In our example, we're going to have 2 new users, one of which is called basic user and the other which is called commissioner. So I'm going to make a basic user. We're talking about security here, so remember to put a password. I'm going to say user in this case. If you don't do that, then you're kind of defeating your own purpose. So let's talk about a couple of other things that come into play on security. A nav file will allow a navigation so that the user can see and go into those areas that we want them to be able to see. So I've created 2, one of which is for just a basic user and one of which is for a commissioner. So I'm going to make, since this is the basic user, I'm going to make them have the user nav file. That will work for the station, but when we come to the web, we also want to talk about the different kinds of access they have through the web profiles. The basic web profile is just a page with no tree down the left-hand side. So in this case, this is a very basic user. We want them to have access to only those things in the nav file, and we don't want them to see the tree, so we use the basic web profile. Okay, now we have not yet told the system though which permissions we want this user to have. So that's done on this line, and what you do is hit this little chevron here, and it opens up a list of all your categories and then what rights a user has as an operator or as an administrator or both. Okay, this is a very basic user, so we might like this user to have access, read access to the HVAC category. This is read, write, and invoke. We want them to be able to see anything in the HVAC category, but we don't necessarily want them to be able to write anything or invoke any commands, like the set command and so on. Okay. This user, we might go ahead and let them see the lighting. We're going to let them see their user service. We'll come back to that in a second. Can they see alarms? Yes. Can they acknowledge alarms? No, they can't. So we'll just give them read access to that. Can they see histories? Sure, why not? Okay, that's what they can read. What can they write? Well, we said that we don't want them to be able to change set points. Certainly don't want them to be able to do anything with the lighting. They cannot acknowledge alarms or do anything, change anything in the history the way it's set up. So the one thing they can do though is go ahead and change their password. So we're going to let them write their password and invoke the save command. Okay. So those are the kinds of things that they can do as an operator, and we'll explain what that means in a minute. This basic user is not going to have any access to any administrative functions on any of these things. If, for example, I gave this user read access to the user services category, then they would be able to see all the other users, but since they don't have any write or invoke capabilities, they couldn't change anything. In this case, we're trying to demonstrate a basic user, though, so we'll leave it that way. Okay. Notice how the little shorthand here. In category 2, they have read. In 3, they have read. In 4, they have read, write, and invoke, and so on. If you want to change that, you can hit the chevron. It just remembers what those are. That takes care of the basic user. Let's go to the second user here. We said we wanted a commissioner. And again, we want to change their password. I'm going to use commissioner. Hope I spelled that right in both cases. Their profile, their nav file to start with, is going to be the commissioner nav file. And their web profile, we're going to leave on the default web profile because that one has the tree. And we'll log in as both of these so you can see it in a second. What kinds of access do they have? Hit the little chevron here. Well, we want them to be able to read and write and invoke, so they can save things, everything in every one of these categories as an operator. They can do all of it. And then as an administrator, we're going to let them read, write, and invoke all kinds of things here. In the case of the user service, let's let them see all the other users, but in their job as the commissioner of the system, they're not going to actually be creating any new users. We'll leave that up to the administrator. So we'll let them see them, but we're not going to let them write or invoke anything. They can acknowledge alarms. They can look at histories and change them. Okay? So that's the kinds of permissions we're giving a commissioner. All right, I think we've got it all set up right. We'll find out here in a second. Tell it okay to save those, and now I've got my 2 users. Okay. Oh, one other thing. Let's talk about one other thing on this user here. We said that the basic user had some rights as an operator, or the commissioner had some rights as an operator and an administrator. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at the slot sheet on a basic user. These are the properties associated with the slot sheet, and full name and language and permissions and whatever. The flags column here has an O in any property that is an operator level property. So what this means is that if the user has rights, permissions, that is, that you just checked off in the operator column, anything with an O here is something they can see. So right now the user could come in and say, see and change their cell phone number, their facets, their password, their email address. In fact, let's let them, just so I can show you how to do this, the full name doesn't have an O operator in the flags column, but if you right click it, you can configure the flags and add the operator. Okay, so now we've got that set up the way we want it to be set, and that takes care of how shows you what the user really means in that case. Okay, so let's log on now as a user so that I can show you what that means. So their name was basic user and their password was user, and we'll log in. Okay, so because